So I've been out working on developing a load for this 2-bore rifle, and what I've settled on is I'm going to settle on the 500 grain load, one I showed you in the last video. I worked it up from 350 clear up to 650, and honestly the best groups I was getting were right at 500 grains. You can see from this target that out of the left barrel I'm getting about a 2.5 inch group on a 3-shot pattern here, and out of the right barrel I'm getting about a 3-inch group on a 3-shot pattern. This one up here, it was through the backer board and didn't actually hit the target, but I measured it out before I took my target down, and it's about a 3-inch group. So that's not too bad. That's a pretty good aggregate for a left and a right with a common load. Half an inch is a lot if you're talking about a 270. It's not a lot if you're talking about a 2-bore. These groups are pretty good aggregates, and the load development, that's how it worked out. I know my customer had requested a 650 grain regulation on this, but the groups opened up quite a bit more at 650. They were the farther I got away from 500, the broader they were getting. They were opening up to about 6 inches. So I settled back to about 500. From 500 down to 350, the groups were actually pretty similar. Wasn't a lot of change in them. So really, the only difference between shooting a 350 and a 500 out of this, the groups are a little bigger at 350, not much, about a half an inch aggregate bigger, but the velocities, there's a considerable gain in velocity from 350 to 500. So that really makes a difference, and of course with the velocity you also get recoil, so the 500s do kick quite a bit more, but that's closer to what he wanted, so that's where we're going to stick with. The spread on this, for having done absolutely no regulation, the spread on this really isn't too bad. I've seen much worse in other double rifles. From a starting point, I've got about 9 inches of spread on the horizon from center of group to center of group. It's about 9 inches of spread, and then on the vertical it's about 11 inches from center of group to center of group. So not really bad. At 50 yards, it shouldn't be a real tough job to regulate this down. And so what I'm going to do is I'll show you the tool that I had to make to do this and how it's done, and I'm going to work them down to the horizon line first, get them to where both groups are patterning on the same horizon line. And as far as the target goes, it really doesn't matter to me where it's at on the target because the sights are uncut right at the minute. All I need to do is get it down to where they're both on the same horizon line, wherever that is. And then of course I'll have to bring them together to the same vertical line to where they're at bore width. Basically they need to, the aggregate of the groups needs to be at the same width as the bores on the muzzles. So that's the plan, is to start by bringing them down to the same horizon and then bring the group together until it gets to within a reasonable closeness of the same width as the bore distance is from center line to center line. So I'll show you how that's done and the tools I use to do that, and then we'll go on from there. To give you an idea of what the goal here is, this is a target from a 12-bore that I regulated a while back, and this was the final group on it. You can see there's a lot of outside work that was done here, a lot of shots were put through it, but the final regulation group on it, this is from the left barrel. It's a 3-shot group, and it's about an inch, 325 thousandths aggregate group. And this is a group from the right barrel, and it's about 930 thousandths. This is a 12-bore, so 720 thousandths balls. So that's not bad. And the distance apart on the horizon is about 3.5 inches, 3 1/4, somewhere right in there. So it's really close to industry standard. Industry standard is generally considered a 3-inch group aggregate from lefts and rights. So this is the goal of where I'm headed with this 2-bore. Is I want to see a 2-bore group that's 3 shots of about 2.5 inches with the common load out of that left barrel. I want to see 3 shots that are about 3 inches common group out of the right barrel. And then the 2 groups together, I want to see them at about bore width, hopefully, but 3 inches or so is considered acceptable for double rifle regulation. It's kind of an industry standard. I mentioned that in some of the other videos, that a 3-inch aggregate group. With the 2-bore, because it shoots a inch 325 thousandths ball, 3 inches may be a little unreasonable to achieve. I'm going to try and get as tight a group as I can, obviously, but it may end up being like a 4 or 5 inch total aggregate group of 6 shots, 3 out of each barrel. But anyways, I wanted to show you what the goal is. The goal is to get 2 groups that look basically like this out of the common load, and get them regulated to where they're on the same horizon line and close together, for the most reasonable accuracy. A perfect regulation would be that these groups would be at absolute bore width. So this being a 12 bore, these groups should be about right here. That's very, very difficult to achieve. It takes sometimes it can take hundreds of hours of work to keep regulating the muzzles to get them down to that kind of group. So generally, like I said, in the industry, the standard is generally considered 3 inches. If you get a group that looks this good and is about 3.5 inches, that's considered a well-regulated double rifle. Like I said, though, perfection would be to get the group down to bore width and looking like this. But that's the goal, and I'm going to show you the tools and how I'm going to do that. So there are a few tools you need to do regulation work, and there's a couple different kinds of tools you can use, but they basically all do the same thing. I had to build this one this week because the one I have that looks just like this is a smaller version. This is the first time I've ever had to regulate a 2-bore, so the version I had basically went up to about an 8-bore size. And the way this tool works is it's just a piece of steel with a couple handles on it. And it's got a couple slots in it, and then you have a set of brass bushings. And you turn these bushings so that they're just under bore size. You don't want them to like twist around in there. You want them to be a fit, but you don't want them to be super snug or tight. You want them to be loose enough that they slide in and out easy. And make sure you account for the expansion and contraction from the heat, because obviously being soldered, it's going to have to be heated up to make the solder flow. So you want to turn these undersized just a little bit, but you don't want them sloppy. You want them to be a good fit. And then, of course, they're adjustable so that you can get them to the exact center line of the bore. And brass, that's pretty much a necessity. You really want to use brass to do this because you don't want to damage the muzzles and the crown work. So brass will prevent any damage to the rifling and whatnot. So you get a handle like this, basically, a couple slots so that they're adjustable, and then you turn a set of bushings to match whatever caliber you're regulating. These are turned to match the 2-bore. I've got sets of these for my other handle. I've got sets of these that go from 8-bore down to about, the smallest I've ever done was a 36 caliber. So I've got different bushings, and anytime I have a different caliber, I just turn a new set of these to match the caliber I'm turning. I would recommend this. I learned this the hard way myself. Get a set of cheap wood handles, whatever you got to do. Put some kind of insulator on the handle of this thing. One of the first jobs I did regulating a double rifle, I didn't take into account that heat transfers, and the more you go twisting on this and playing with it and whatnot, eventually that heat's going to work its way up the handle. And I did a pretty good job of burning my hand one day because I didn't take into account that this stuff will get pretty warm after a while if you're doing much of it. With the 2-bore, that's probably not going to be a problem. Because I'm not going to be able to reheat it time and time again on the same day. I just can't shoot it that many times in a day. But with smaller calibers where you can go out and shoot them 20, 30, 40, 50 shots at a time, every time you come in and heat it back up and work with it, your tool may not cool down in between shots, so you can have the potential for heating your tool up. So a good set of insulated handles will protect your hands a little bit anyways. So, what I'll do, the way I'm going to do this is what I've done on pretty much every double rifle I've built. I'll take the sight off, obviously. I'll put a couple of metal spacers on there, just like I did when I was soldering the rib on, and I'll use a couple of clamps and you know, I'll put a spacer on to hold the sight in place. I'll put a spacer in a couple spots to hold the under rib on, and you know, 1 or 2 on to hold the top rib on. And you know, basically I want to go back about 6 inches. So you know, I want to use 2 or 3 clamps and put one, you know, at the sight base, at the front of the rib, and back, you know, a couple inches, and you know, some spacers to hold the bottom rib on as well. And that way, as I'm heating this up and the solder starts to flow, things don't come completely loose. These don't have to be clamped on super tight. They just need to hold everything in place. Matter of fact, super tight is a disadvantage. It doesn't allow you to move things very well. So some clamps and some blocks or wedges to hold things in place once you get the solder flowing. And then of course I'll use the same method to heat the muzzles as I used to do the ribs. I'll heat these up in my furnace. I'll slip 2 in at a time, 1 in each muzzle. And I'll go, you know, the full length in basically, because I do want to heat, you know, probably 6 or 8 inches of the muzzle, because I want to be able to flex, you know, the whole distance here. And I'll just keep swapping them out just like I did when I was soldering that until I get my solder to flow. And once my solder starts to flow, then I will slip this tool in to the muzzles, and I'll twist down on it, because in this case I know that the left barrel is shooting higher than the right, or the right barrel, pardon me, is shooting higher than the left barrel. And so I'll want to twist down so that it pushes the left barrel up and the right barrel down to bring them down to the same horizon line. And then I'll let it completely cool, let everything stiffen up, get the solder to set again, take all the clamps back off, put the sight back on, and I'll go out and shoot it again. And depending on where the groups end up, then I'll bring it back in and heat it up again and make another adjustment. And these adjustments are going to be fairly small, because you got to think of it just like I explained before. You got to think of it like a triangle. A very small amount of change at the peak of the triangle makes for a very large amount of change 50 yards out. So very small changes here will make for very large changes out here. And so these movements are going to be fairly small. The amount of twist I put into them will be fairly small increments. I'll go out and shoot it, test it, and see where I end up at. If I get really lucky, which I have once or twice been really lucky, I've been able to do this in just a few times, where I make 1 or 2 adjustments and the regulation falls right into place. That's not typical or normal. It's pretty rare to get everything to just fall right into place, but if you go slow, you don't make massive adjustments, and you take your time, it's pretty easy to regulate actually. So once I get it twisted to where it's both of those groups are shooting on the horizon line like I explained, then I'll use the clamps and heat the solder up, and I'll pull the wedge out a little bit and clamp it down, use the clamp to pull it together and tighten it up, and that'll bring the groups together. And I'll just do that the same way. I'll make a small adjustment, let it set, let it all cool, go out and shoot it, see where I end up with, come back in, make another adjustment. This takes some time obviously, because you have to make adjustments, let everything cool, go shoot it, make adjustments, let everything cool, go shoot it. And with a 2-bore, unlike a normal caliber that you can put, you know, quite a few shots through, you know, if you're shooting 6 shots a day out of this thing, that's a lot actually. The recoil is pretty tough on a guy, and so you just can't go out and do this in one day. That's also been one of the reasons that load workup been slow on this, is because you know, I can only shoot just so many shots a day out of it, and then I got to let my body heal up a little bit from shooting it. Matter of fact, right now I've currently got a little gouge on my cheek from a little cut in my cheek about just below my left eye from where my safety glasses, my shooter's glasses, got caught on my thumb. I think wasn't really paying attention, but I think my thumb caught my safety glasses, and it pushed them into my cheek and left just a little cut there. So it's things like that slow you down with these really big bores. But that's the general idea of how I'm going to do regulation. Is you know, there's the tools you need are a basic tool like this that you can adjust for bore, and something to heat your muzzles up with, and then a way to keep everything in place so that it doesn't come completely loose once the solder loosens up. And it just takes time. That's really all it boils down to, is it takes time to shoot it and make adjustments and let everything cool, and shoot it and make adjustments, let everything cool. This is the type of tool that I use for regulation, but there is another type that I've seen in use, and I don't actually have one. I haven't built one. I have thought about it several times. I just haven't found the time to do it. But the other version is basically it's a block of steel that goes completely over your muzzles, and it has some gap in it all the way around, and then it has threaded brass rod that's threaded down through the block, and you'll have a rod down and a rod up and a rod in on each side, and so that as you heat everything up, the clamp is already in place, and all you have to do is twist your brass rods in, and it pushes up or down, whichever direction you need to go, and it pushes in or out, or it pushes in to go out. If you need to force the muzzles out, of course you'd push the wedge in, and it would spread the muzzles out. And so that's the other type of tool. I wish I had one to show you, but I've never made one. But it's just a block of steel that's like ½ inch, 3/4, something like that thick, and it's just opened up. I've seen them where they're rounded, I've seen them where they're square inside, doesn't really matter, and they need just a little bit of gap all the way around, whatever muzzles you're going to do. And then your brass rod comes down through, is threaded right through the block, and it just is like a pushing tool basically, and it's just like a pushing clamp, more or less, I should say that, and it just allows you to run the threaded brass up in there and push up or down and in if you need to. So that's the other type of tool, and like I said, I've never used one myself. I tend to use this method. These tools are cheap and simple to make, and I can change the ferrules and whatnot, but the bushings, I can change those anytime I need to any size basically. But the other type of tool, of course, you don't need any bushings or anything. The brass rods allow you to push from basically every direction, and the wedge allows you to spread the barrels if you need to spread them. Once all the regulation is done and everything's shooting where I'm satisfied with it and happy with the groups I'm getting and the aggregates of the 2 barrels, then I'll go ahead and cut the wedge off and flush it off faced, and then from there out, everything else on this gun is finish work. So that's where I'm at on this, and I'll get on with it starting the beginning of next week. I'll start doing regulation shots on this and go from there.